Inspiring interviews with today's top landlords. This is the Rental Income Podcast. And now, Dan Lane.
Jeff, you live in a great area to buy rental properties. The properties are pretty affordable. The rents are pretty high. There's lots of cash flow. It makes a lot of sense to invest in your area, but you still chose to invest out of state. What were you thinking? Like, why not just invest in your own backyard?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dan. So it's probably a little counterintuitive. I live in Atlanta, and the Southeast is, widely known as the hotbed of where everyone is moving to and relocating to. But honestly, when I started looking for multifamily properties, which is, my preference is 2 to 4 units, what I was finding in and around Atlanta were really properties that were not in great areas. So think, lower C class, upper D class. And I didn't want I didn't want to really focus on that area. I'm looking more for B, neighborhoods that are B class and above. That's the sweet spot, or even, high C. But what I found was in New York, for the same amount of money, I could get a much nicer property with typically much more space that definitely cash flowed. And I think that was the big thing, right? Like, I know it's counterintuitive, but New York had the cash flow that I was looking for. It's still appreciated at, typically 3% a year. And that was really the motivation.
On the podcast today, we'll figure out how Jeff built his portfolio. We'll talk about how he found the deals that he bought. We'll talk about how he found a local property manager. We'll take a look at one of his deals and go over all of his numbers, and things haven't been 100% smooth. Jeff has had a couple of challenges along the way. We'll talk about what happened, how he overcame it, and what he learned from it. Joining us on the show today from Atlanta is Jeff Costa. We'll take a quick break to thank our sponsors. We'll come right back and we'll talk to Jeff. It's a lot of work to find a really good rental property. And when you actually find that property, you want to make sure you're working with a lender that can get that loan closed. The lender that I recommend is Chaley Ridge from Ridge Lending Group. She's a nationwide lender, and her specialty is helping investors finance rental properties. She has a ton of loan programs, and she can find something customized to you for your situation. If you want to find out more or you're ready to get started today, just go to ridgelendinggroup.com. That's RIDGE lendinggroup.com. NMLS 42056.
Rental Income Podcast.
Out of all the areas you can invest, why did you pick upstate New York?
So what I ended up doing was looking back at where I grew up, which was Western New York. And when I started evaluating the market, it was pretty clear to me that the amount of value I could get for the same price point that I wanted to pay was much higher in Western New York, even in an area that is widely known to have higher property taxes.
So did you look at New York because you were familiar with the area, or did you consider other areas too? Or did New York just seem comfortable because you knew it?
New York seemed comfortable because I still had family there, and I thought I've got boots on the ground that can absolutely help me in a pinch if I needed to get something done. I also knew the neighborhoods. I knew the zip codes. I knew, what were, at least when I lived there, the good and bad parts of town. And I felt like having that intrinsic information was an advantage, right? So that I could rule things out much more quickly.
Let's talk just like some general numbers. So like what's the difference between the type of property that you bought in New York versus if you had bought a similar property in a similar neighborhood in Atlanta? Like, what's the price difference?
What's the difference? The difference in the properties is really about the age of the property and how it has been upkept. So what I found in Atlanta was these multifamilies, even though they were a newer vintage, had much more wear and tear on them than New York houses. And don't get me wrong, like some of these New York houses are built in the early 1900s, but they are rocks. And it was just amazing to me to see the difference in how the properties were kept and the durability of them.
So what about price wise? Like, so what did you pay for the property in New York?
Yeah, I paid 225,000 for this property
Okay.
that we're going to talk about today. I paid 225 for a duplex in New York, and it had a first floor unit that was completely renovated. It was the previous owner was an owner occupant, so she rented the downstairs and lived in the upstairs. But that to me was a huge jump immediately. So it meant that I could attract a better tenant who wanted the type of amenities that she had put in, and then I wouldn't have to spend that capex up front.
So if you were to find a similar property in a similar neighborhood in Atlanta, like what do you think that would cost?
Yeah, that cost would have been significantly more than in New York. In Atlanta, that similar duplex would have run me anywhere from 270 at the low end to about 329 on the high end.
Okay, so the advantage there is that you've got a smaller down payment because you're buying a cheaper property and then you're getting a better return.
Correct.
Now, talk to me about the taxes because when I've looked just casually on Zillow, I'm always looking at properties in different areas. The property taxes in upstate New York just seem really high. Was that a challenge to make your numbers work?
It was. It was absolutely a challenge. It usually, when I was running my underwriting, would be the largest single line item that I had to care about. So, what I ended up doing was making sure that looking at the last time a property was evaluated and understanding how the city of Rochester actually goes about reevaluating a property, meaning do they do it, does a sale trigger a reevaluation period?
Mm.
And that was certainly challenging, right? But in the cases that I looked for this house, the numbers still worked, even with the larger property taxes. So I was trying to be very strategic about this and understanding that I would not be getting any kind of property tax increase for at least a couple of years.
Okay.
And even if I did, the numbers still worked.
Well, let's walk through how you did this. So you decide, okay, I'm not going to invest in Atlanta. That it's just not going to work out. I'm going to go in New York. What was the first thing that you did? The first step that you took?
Yes, I compiled a short list of local to Rochester real estate agents, and I was keying in on someone who already had existing rentals because they understood what it means to be a landlord. They understood what I would be looking for versus someone who was buying, a primary home. The next thing I did was to make sure that I could use FaceTime with this agent to do virtual walkthroughs because, by virtue of not being there, I'm handicapped a little bit in terms of what I can see. So that was the other thing I wanted to ensure. And then I wanted to make sure that the agent had an eye for the details of what could potentially torpedo a rental property, which is to say, they understood the age of the roof. They understand, and we looked at mechanicals as we walked through them to understand and look at labels, for example, on water tanks to understand when they were made, so that we would have some idea of what the potential capex would be in the future for the property.
Did you have to talk to a couple of different agents before you found the right one, or did you get lucky right out of the gate?
I got lucky out of the gate, and it was great because I stumbled on an agent that was part of a organization that did property management, and they had their own construction arm. So they were more of a vertically integrated organization, all focused on primarily investors. So it really worked out well because I ended up using them as a property manager as well.
Awesome. Okay, so that kind of solved two problems: that you had your agent, you had your property manager, and then as far as trying to figure out the neighborhoods to invest in, did you have an idea already because you were familiar with the area?
I had a little bit on the guidance of the local agent because they knew some things that I did not about what some of the economic drivers were that would impact me. For example, in Buffalo, there was a Tesla Gigafactory that was coming online. And of course, that would mean a certain demand of housing within a radius of that plant. And while I could have looked that up online, it was really helpful for him to be able to tell me, like, this is where people who would potentially work at that plant would want to live. So it was a little bit of knowledge or research on my part, but coupled with his intimate knowledge of the market and some of the market dynamics.
How long has it been now? How long have you been investing here?
I have been investing for a total of 2.5 years.
Okay. And how many properties have you bought?
So far, I have 4 properties.
Okay. Are they all duplexes?
They're all duplexes. I have this thing about seemingly collecting duplexes.
Yeah. Well, awesome. Well, let's take a look at one of your deals. Maybe we could look at your most recent deal and kind of walk through the numbers. So what did you pay for this property?
This property was $225K.
Okay. And did it need any rehab work when you bought it?
It did. Well, the lower unit did not. It was completely rehabbed. So, but the upper one definitely needed a little bit of work, most in the kitchen. It had one of those 1970s orange countertop, grandma style kitchens with old cabinetry and old appliances. So one of the first things I knew I needed to do if I wanted to get the rents that I had projected was to do a rehab on that kitchen. I also did a fair amount of painting and pressure washing to make the property more attractive. And then I had some water infiltration remediation to do in the basement. So I had a sump pump system put in place there.
And did your agent help coordinate all that?
He did, actually, yes. He actually steered me to the contractor that we ended up using for the kitchen. I actually found the water remediation person myself, but the pressure washing and painting also was a recommendation from the agent.
Awesome. So how much did everything cost?
The all-in amount was about $246K.
246. So all right, so the purchase was 225. So the rehab was about 21,000.
Correct.
Okay. All right, so you're all in at 248. Now, as far as financing it, did you do a regular 25% down loan?
Correct. 25% down, conventional 30-year fixed loan. Kept myself and not my spouse on the deed so that I could potentially purchase more properties under conventional financing. But yeah, it was a conventional loan.
That's a very smart thing you just said. Explain that to anyone that doesn't understand what you're doing here.
Yes. So lending guidelines specify that the maximum amount of properties any single individual can hold for a Fannie Mae Freddie Mac loan is 10. And I certainly had ambitions to go higher than that. So what I ended up doing was, while I could have easily, put my wife and myself on the loan itself, I elected to simply put my own name on it so that in the future I could buy more properties under my name and then potentially more under her name.
Right. So you can get 10 properties in your name. Your wife can get 10 in her name. So you can get 20 Fannie Freddie loans, which is
correct.
Which is really good. So, all right. So what is your mortgage payment on this property?
The mortgage is $1,510 per month.
Okay. And how much are your total rents that you bring in?
$2,705.
Okay. So after you pay the mortgage, you have $1,195 left over. How are you budgeting for repairs, vacancies, just whatever comes up?
Yeah. Every one of my properties has its own dedicated checking account. And in that checking account, I maintain 2 months of mortgage payments, just really for my own comfort level. And then I also funnel anything that is, what you would consider a monthly profit after, keeping those checking accounts topped up into a savings account so that if I have, unexpected repairs, I have a fund to draw from on that. I try to keep that fund around the 15K mark for any property, any single property. And usually that tends to be enough, right? It's probably pretty rare if you're going to have any single item cost more than 15K. And then if I use that money, I simply build it back up again until I hit that 15K number again.
And like, where do you keep that money? Are you looking for a bank with a high interest rate?
Yeah, I typically the interest rates on bank checking accounts were almost infinitesimal. Like think,
Yeah.
0.0 something.
Yeah.
So most recently, I opened a business brokerage account, which candidly, like 6 months ago, I didn't know existed. But I banked with Wells Fargo and they offered that. And what I did is move a chunk of that money over to the business brokerage account, not to speculate with it, but to actually invest it in a mutual fund, a money market mutual fund, which is very, very liquid and very, very safe, but earns, about 5.1% every single month. So it's another way to kind of juice those returns of the money that is otherwise sitting idle.
Yeah, I mean, that's smart. I mean, you might as well get the highest interest rate you can. So with the cash flow that comes in, like, are you spending any of it, or are you basically keeping it all in savings?
I try to keep it all inside the business. I don't think I've made a single withdrawal at all. I just try to keep recycling it, right? Like my goal is to, keep those reserve funds at the level they need to be. And then once they're there, I continue to save for the next down payment for the next duplex.
So eventually then you'll get to the point where your rentals are buying you more rentals.
Exactly.
Awesome.
You just hit the magic key.
I love it. I love it. Well, let's talk about management, because I think that is probably the most important part of the rental property to make sure everything's profitable and you have good tenants in there. How has the management been?
Yeah, this was interesting. So I actually, when I flew up to actually see the house for the first time a day or so ahead of closing, and had previously scheduled a meeting with the property manager. And I went to his office in downtown Rochester and met him. He was the only person in the office, and it was a nice office, had a meeting room and a pretty large space. And he had, while we were there, he was taking calls, which kind of surprised me, but he was essentially doing some rehabs on his own properties. And I'm like, well, that's pretty cool. Like, he's got his own properties and he's doing his own thing. And ultimately where this went to was this same property manager ended up ghosting me in the middle of a contract, literally stopped responding to the tenants, and stopped responding to me. And he literally disappeared from the face of the earth. I had to go try to track him down through social media. There was no active accounts. I even called the building that I had previously gone to and talked to the receptionist. And I said, hey, is so-and-so still a tenant here? And like, oh no, they cleared out.
Wow.
Literally, this was something I would have never expected.
What about your rent money? Did he take off with your money?
He did. He was still collecting rent while pretending to do the role. So I ended up having to try to claw back, and I did it successfully, some of that money that he was just collecting without doing any work. And candidly, there were signs here, right? Like he was a solo act, and you really can't be a property manager by yourself. It takes a team. And great that he was doing his own thing with properties, but that also showed me that he would have less time to spend on my property.
Right.
And then another red flag was, when I asked him about, hey, how do you, what's the tenant portal look like? What's the owner portal look like? He mentioned about wanting to create and build his own, which I can, I think that's okay that, aspirationally you want to do that, but there are certainly great solutions in place. And what I found was I was getting direct payments from the tenants via Zelle, and then I was paying him. So there was no system in place.
Okay, so the tenants were paying you rent directly, and then you were paying the management fee to your manager?
Correctly, which is antithetical to how it actually should work.
Yeah, most of the time the property manager is going to collect the rent, take their fee, and then give you what's left over. But in this case, you got really lucky because he could have taken off with your rent checks.
He absolutely could have done that. Yes.
Wow. That's really good. So really, really good for you that that you didn't lose more money, but I guess you lost money in that you paid him for a few months when he wasn't doing the work.
Correct. Yeah.
Wow.
It's the cost of doing business,
Yeah.
and it definitely was a learning experience for me.
So then what did you learn from this? Like, so after going through this experience, what were you looking for in your next manager?
I was looking for a lot of things, like I said, that perhaps I didn't pay attention to. I was looking for things like, what's the company background? Like, how long have you been doing this? And what kind of properties do you specialize in? I wanted to make sure that they weren't, for example, specializing in short-term rentals when I needed someone who was focused on long-term rentals. But more to the point, it was about systems and processes, right? I wanted to understand, like, who's on the team? What do they do? Can you take on my property given your existing workload? And what software do you use to manage the property, right? Because typically there's, as you mentioned earlier, there's a portal that is both tenant facing and owner facing. And I really wanted to make sure that that was in place. And I insisted on looking at, samples of what the monthly report would look like for an owner to make sure that I would be getting the information that I needed.
Yeah, the thing that I've found about property managers, and I've had some good managers and some bad managers, but the bad managers that I've had, I feel like they knew how to sell me. Like they knew how to say, yeah, we're doing this and we're doing that. Like they knew all the right things to say. Like, did you feel like that first manager kind of knew how to BS you a little bit?
Yes. And no one likes to admit that they were taken, so to speak, by that you fell into the someone who's a good salesman.
Yeah.
And absolutely felt that way. And it honestly, it felt a little bit vulnerable, right? Like he took advantage of me. And, it really changed how I looked at property managers in the future.
Jeff has actually written a book called The Investor's Guide to Selecting Property Managers. It's got 100 questions that you should ask your property managers and the answers that you're looking for. If you want to find it, I've got a link to it on my website. You can find it at rentalincomepodcast.com/episode 489. I'd like to thank Chaley Ridge from Ridge Lending Group for sponsoring today's episode. If you're looking to buy a rental property, whether you're just getting started or you want to add to your portfolio, reach out to Chaley. She's got a ton of different loan programs, and she can find something that'll work for you. If you want to find out more, just go to ridgelendinggroup.com, NMLS 42056. Thank you so much for checking out the podcast today. Make sure you hit the follow button, and that way you'll get notified when the next episode comes out. My name is Dan Lane, and this has been the Rental Income Podcast.